Hello and welcome back to a new episode. In this episode, we'll set up our tools and repository to easily and effectively document API references. Now, before we start this episode, I want to read out a disclaimer. This setup is specifically what I use for documentation. If you have a different setup, you could go with it. The definition of right setup depends on your needs and restrictions. However, in my years of experience as a tech writer, I've found that this setup that I'm about to demonstrate is fit for purpose across multiple organizations, primarily because it leverages open source tools. But like I've said before, whether or not it's right for you depends on your needs and organizational support. So let's begin. Like we mentioned before, first you need to establish a circle of SME, reviewers, and approvers. This video assumes that we are the SME, reviewer, and approver. So let's jump directly to the API collection and API testing tools. We'll be using Postman's API collection for Swagger's pet store. You can easily find it by searching for the pet store collection in the search engine of your choice. If you look further into this collection, you'll find that this collection doesn't require any authorization because it's publicly available for anyone to use. However, the same may not be the case for your API collection, so make sure you have the authorization details needed to make the API calls using your Postman collection. Now we'll set up Visual Studio Code to make our lives easier. For that purpose, we'll install 3 extensions. Let's do them one by one.
First, we'll install JSON to YAML extension. It's used to convert file formats between JSON and YAMLs easily. Then, we'll install OpenAPI extension. OpenAPI extension helps to make sure our documentation matches OpenAPI standards. And finally, we'll install Prettify JSON. You might not need this, but it will come handy when you start documenting the APIs. Prettify JSON basically beautifies your JSON file and shows like a beautiful tree view structure of the JSON file format. Now, let's clone our GitHub repository into a local directory. For this video, I have already created a repository in my GitHub account. Your organization might also have a Git repository that you could use, but in order to clone it, you'll have to follow a similar approach. So let's clone it. To get started with GitHub, make sure you have already installed Git in your local machine. Then, get the HTTPS URL to your repository. In GitHub, you'll find it here. I'll be cloning this repository in sites folder within my local machine. Okay, let's go to the terminal and then run a few commands. First, let's go to the local directory where the Git repository would be cloned and run the git command to clone the repository. All right, cloning's done. Now change to the directory that has the main documentation viewer file. This is where all additional files should also be stored. That's it. Your Git repository is now in your local computer. I want to bring your attention back to the repository I cloned. When I cloned the repository, I also pulled an HTML file. That file is the main documentation viewer file and related to RapidDoc. I had already stored the index.html file in the GitHub repository for my ease. You also have the option to create a fresh HTML file by copying the code that you can find from RapidDoc's website, as you can see here. Save this code as index.html inside the directory you'd be working on, and you should be good to go. Now that we're done setting up the repo, we'll now set up documentation test server. I've already set up a local server in my computer that runs an HTML file. Depending on the machine you're using, the setup process can be different. If you're using Windows, enable IIS and put all of your files inside initpub/www root folder. To check the files, run localhost in the browser of your choice. But because I'm using a Mac, I'm using Python's HTTP server to serve localhost on port 8000. So basically what you want to do is in the terminal, you want to type this following code and run localhost in the browser.
Just a note here, Python and Python's HTTP server module may not be readily available in your computer. So what you want to do is install Python, the latest version of Python, which is 3.0 and higher, and you should be able to execute the code that serves localhost on port 8000, as you can see on the screen. That brings us to the end of the setup. In the next video, we'll also create an empty YAML file and empty JSON file in the same folder where all of our OpenAPI specification would go. Till then, stay safe.